resurrection. We started 2 weeks ago in the Greek context, in Thessaloniki, and then in Corinth for two reasons. First, because Paul's letters are the earliest Christian writings, period. First Thessalonians is the earliest writing to come down to us from the Jesus movement, probably written in the year 40 or 41, so early. The other reason that we began with Paul's letters is because they provided a window into the beliefs and attitudes of people in the face of death, Greeks and Romans. What did they believe? How did they experience the loss, the deep wound of grief? And together we walked around in the tombstones, in the graveyard. You remember we translated tombstone inscriptions. And then last week we looked at the belief, the expectation of the educated elite that the soul at death would escape from the body and go on somewhere. And Paul responded to that with a long, reasoned argument for the resurrection, for God's resurrection of the totality of the human person, soul and body. Now, today we turn to the Gospels, written 20 or 30 years after the letters of Paul. But the final chapters of the Gospels are extremely important because they narrate the event that is the fulcrum, the pivot, the central moment in history, the resurrection of Jesus, where it all started. And I sent you as a handout for today a one-page tabulation of the places where the stories of Jesus' resurrection are presented in the Gospels. Now, when you looked at that, you may have noticed that the first Gospel, the oldest one, the Gospel of Mark, is not on the list. Why not? That is because the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark come to an end at chapter 16, verse 8. That's it. In the earliest manuscripts, there are no resurrection appearances in the Gospel of Mark. In Mark chapter 1, chapter 16, verses 1 to 8, what we have instead of a resurrection appearance is what? Yes, the discovery of the empty tomb. And I want to just read it for you. I'm going to translate it literally from this Greek Bible. And when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, they bought spices. They bought spices in order to anoint him. And they came early in the morning, Leon Proi. That's the earliest hour of the morning, right at sunrise. On the first day of the week, they came to the Menaeon, the tomb, as the sun was coming up. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away for us the stone at the door of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. And Mark adds, it was a very large stone. And going to the tomb, they saw a young man, a neoniskos, seated on the right side, clothed in a white garment. And they were completely afraid. The Greek verb is exetambethesan. They were shocked. They were blown away, startled. And the young man says to them, do not be afraid. Jesus, you are seeking, the Nazarene, the one crucified. He was raised. And he is not here. See the place where they laid him. But depart and say to his disciples and to Peter, he goes before you into Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he said to you. And now, chapter 16, verse 8. This is the last verse in the oldest copies of the Gospel of Mark. And going out, they fled from the tomb, for they had fear and trembled. And they said nothing to anyone. Ephobunto, God, for they were afraid. 2 weeks from today, we will focus on this motif of fear at the resurrection, and we will explore it spiritually and psychologically. But today I want to talk about the report itself. The earliest gospel Mark, no report of an appearance. The women discover that the tomb is empty. They see the place where he lay. The next gospel is Matthew chapter 28. And you may notice it's different. If you look at your handout, now there are not 3 Marys, there are only 2 Marys. And they come to the tomb, and as they are coming, there is an earthquake. And they see, when they get near the tomb, an angel of the Lord descending from heaven. He rolled back the stone and sat upon it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And because of fear of him, the guards shook and fell down as if they were dead. But the angel said to the women, do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has been raised. As he said, come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell the disciples. He has been raised from the dead, and indeed he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for you. So they left the tomb quickly with great fear and joy, and they were running to tell the disciples. And now watch what happens next. Suddenly, Jesus met them and said, greetings. And they came to him and took hold of his feet and worshiped him. And then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. There's that motif again. Don't be afraid. We will talk about it in 2 weeks. Go and tell my brothers that I go to Galilee, back where it all started. Back up in Galilee. There they will see me. Then a little bit later, when the disciples are in Galilee, the 11, Matthew says, why not 12? Judas had committed suicide, right? Matthew chooses not to tell that story. But the 11 go back to Galilee to a mountain, and Jesus appears to them there, as he said he would. And some of the disciples worshiped him, but Matthew says, some continued to doubt. That's right. They doubted. And Jesus said to them, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to observe whatever I have taught you. And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the world. So, those are the two earliest accounts in our Gospels. The third one, Luke, chapter 24. Luke expands the circle. First of all, the women become more numerous. Luke says that the women went to get spices, and then chapter 24, on the first day of the week, the women came. And Luke names them Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and the other women, a large group of women. With them, they all those women came to the tomb. Quite a group, and they found the stone rolled away. They saw men in, he doesn't call them angels, men in dazzling clothes stood beside the tomb. The women were afraid. The angels ask, or the men ask, who do you look for? You're looking for the living among the dead. He is not here. He is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over and must suffer many things, and on the third day rise again. So the women flee from the tomb, and they go tell the disciples. And Peter and John begin what? A race to the tomb. John is younger than Peter, so he gets there first. And Peter goes and looks into the tomb, and he sees the linen clothes lying by themselves and is amazed at what happened. Later that same day, two disciples, only one of them is named Cleopas. They are leaving Jerusalem on their way to a little town named Emmaus, only 7 miles outside the city. And as they are walking along, they are sad, heartbroken. And a stranger comes up and joins them and asks them why they are so downcast. And as you remember, they say to the stranger, can you be the only one in Jerusalem who does not know what they did to Jesus of Nazareth? And we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And then Luke says that the stranger opened to them the scripture and explained what they didn't understand, that it would be necessary for the Christ, the Messiah, to die and then to be raised. As they are approaching the little town of Emmaus, the stranger appears to be going into the town, and the two disciples, Cleopas and his friend, say to the stranger, it is already evening, the sun is going down, turn aside here with us. And the stranger goes with them. And they sit down at the table, and the stranger picks up the bread and blesses it and breaks it. And then what? Their eyes are open, and they recognize him. And then he vanishes from their sight. But that's not the end of the story in Luke. The story continues just a bit in Luke, because Luke says that Jesus appeared to the disciples again. And he said to them as they were gathered, peace be with you. They were startled and terrified. They thought they were seeing what? A ghost. Now, Luke makes the point, it was not a ghost. Jesus said to them, why are you frightened? Why do doubts arouse in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and blood like you see me have, flesh and bone. And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they were disbelieving and wondering, he said to them, have you anything to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. And then he said to them, these are the words that I have spoken while I was with you, that were written in the law of Moses, that they must be fulfilled. And again, he opens their minds to understand the scripture, that his suffering was necessary. He tells them to stay in the city until they are clothed with power from God. And Luke concludes the story by saying that eventually Jesus appeared again in Bethany, just outside Jerusalem. And while he was blessing them, he was withdrawn from their sight up into heaven, and they worshiped him. Last of all, the beautiful accounts of the resurrection appearance found in the Gospel of John. John chapter 20 and 21. And here, Mary Magdalene is the focus. Early on the morning of the first day, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb. No mention of other women, other Marys. And she finds that the tomb is empty. She goes to tell the disciples. Simon Peter and John race to the tomb. John is younger. He gets there first, but he doesn't go inside. He sits outside the tomb. The older man, Peter, comes next, and he goes right into the tomb. And they see that the tomb is empty. And the grave clothes in which Jesus had been wrapped are lying there, as well as the headcloth. The disciples leave and go back home. Mary Magdalene is still there in the garden, and she is weeping. Someone approaches her. She mistakes him for whom? The gardener. And she says, sir, if you have taken the body away, tell me where you have laid it, and I will go and take it. And then the stranger, the gardener, as she thinks, does what? Speaks her name. It's so beautiful. He says, Mary. And suddenly she realizes who it is, and she turns around and tries to grasp it. Jesus says, don't hold on to me, for I've not yet ascended to my Father and to your Father, but go and tell the disciples. So then, later that same day, the 11, again, are in an upper room, and Jesus appears and stands among them. And there is one of the disciples who is full of doubt. Who is that? Thomas. Thomas says, unless I see the nail wounds and put my hand in the side, I will not believe. And so Jesus addresses Thomas directly. He says, come and see that it is me. Touch me. And he tells Thomas, you are blessed because you have believed. Even more blessed those who have not seen and will come to believe. In the next chapter, the disciples have gone back to Galilee. In fact, they have gone where? Fishing. They have resumed their old trade, their way of life. John names 7 disciples who set out in a boat fishing on the Sea of Tiberias. They don't catch anything. The day begins to dawn, and they row the boat toward the shore, and the beloved disciple sees a stranger standing on the shore with a little charcoal fire, cooking fish and bread. And John the beloved disciple cries out, "It is the Lord." Peter jumps out of the boat, goes wading to the shore, and eventually the disciples come up with a big net of fish. Jesus told them, put the net down on the right side of the boat and you'll catch fish. They caught 153 fish. That little detail is somehow remembered. And the disciples come up and they have breakfast with Jesus. Now, I've spent some time going through stories that are already familiar to you because I wanted to notice something that on Easter Sunday is seldom observed, and that is the sheer diversity of these stories. They are so different. In the Gospel of Mark, there is only an empty tomb, and it is located in Jerusalem. In Matthew, the angels tell the women, go back where? Galilee. And eventually Jesus does appear to them there. In the Gospel of Luke, all of the resurrection appearances are located where? In or just outside Emmaus, Jerusalem. In the Gospel of Mark, both Jerusalem and Galilee. So the places, the locations are different. Also, the persons to whom Jesus appears are different. Who saw him first? Was it Mary Magdalene? Was it the disciples? Wild diversity. I find that to be very interesting. If the story of Jesus' resurrection had been concocted by the disciples, you would expect what? Greater uniformity, greater unanimity, agreement. But in fact, what we see is just the opposite. And as a historian who analyzes accounts, different and multiple as they are, I feel drawn, Joan, to make a conclusion. What we are looking at is an experience that a number of people had. And they told about it. They repeated the story of the experience. I saw him first. No, he appeared to me. This diversity, I think, leads us to conclude that what happened to them falls into the category of a historical experience. Something really happened. There are some New Testament scholars, critical historians, who recently have argued that the resurrection did not occur. In fact, one of my teachers, a German scholar, Gerd Ludemann, published a book on the resurrection, in which he said the body, no doubt, decayed in the grave. Not so much at this moment as a believer, which I am, but not as a believer, but as a historian. If my old teacher, Gerd Ludemann, were still here among us, I would say to him, the diversity of the accounts, the differences, even the inconsistencies, the contradictions, point to the fact that this experience, it happened. It happened to individuals. In my opinion, Joan, it would be an act of cultural hubris, right? Overweening pride. For me, in the 21st century, living after the Enlightenment with a worldview shaped by what? science. It would be an act of hubris for me to say that people who lived 2,000 years ago in a very different culture with different expectations, it would be wrong for me to pass judgment on their experience and to say, your experience was not authentic. It didn't happen. Let me make an analogy. It may not be a perfect analogy. Some years ago, in January, before I began teaching in New York, at United Theological Seminary, I took a group of 17 seminary students on a month-long immersion in Brazil. Wow, wouldn't that be fun? We traveled through the cities of the north, Recife, Salvador, Rio. We even went into the Amazon jungle, and we met with small groups of people who lived in the Amazon basin. And on more than one occasion, individuals shared with us that they had encountered their ancestors in the jungle, on long walks. Who am I to say that they didn't have that experience? Just because that kind of experience is unavailable to me. Historians of the emotions tell us that the emotions, in fact, are not the same across cultures and across time. Experience is historically and culturally determined. So I draw from the diversity of these accounts the conclusion that we are talking about a historical experience, an experience that really happened. John.
This Professor Lewin said that the body decomposed in the grave in 3 days.
No, I think he argues that, like most victims of crucifixion, that the Roman soldiers removed the body and dumped it where? Yes, in a trash heap, exactly. There are trash heaps like that outside of most Roman cities. Archaeologists love them. They found a great big burial pit outside the Esquiline Gate at Rome with tens of thousands of decomposed skeletons, the bodies not only of human beings, but of animals, horses. And some of those that they found in that pit had been crucified. How did they know? It proved impossible to remove the nails from their bones. And so they found the nails down in the pit. So Ludeman argues that the body of Jesus was treated in the same way as other victims of Roman crucifixion. It was dumped into a mass pit, and that the disciples didn't know where it was, and that their experiences were hallucinations and were not historical. Yes?
Before you go on, when you were first translating Revelation to Greek,
Yes.
about the word afraid,
Right.
you used different translation in there.
I did.
I always have trouble with the afraid part. Were they in awe or they were shaking? What's the correct way, and how is it done across all the
Oh,
Bible?
it's so wonderful. Thank you for that. There are two different Greek words already in the Gospel of Mark. The first one is ekbambeo. Can you say that with me? Ekbambeo. Now, bambeo means to be amazed, right? To be in awe. But when you strengthen the main verb by the addition of what? A prefixed preposition, it pushes the meaning of the verb away from reverence and awe, more toward astonishment, right? They were startled. That would be a good translation. They were shocked. The other verb that Mark uses is a verb that we still have in English, be'o. And he uses the middle form for be'omai. Can you say that with me? Oh, be'omai. And we still have this word when we talk about what? Opiates, right. And this word means fear, the primal emotion of fear. That's the verb that is used twice in Mark chapter 16 to describe what the women felt. Mark strengthens that by saying that they were doing what? They were trembling. They were trembling. And they fled. In fact, this verb in the past tense, the imperfect, ethobunto, is the next to the last word in Mark's gospel. So as I said, in 2 weeks, you and I together will confront the evidence that fear accompanied the resurrection. And we will try to figure it out. What does it mean in the text? What does it mean for us today? If we experience fear, what's that about? But for today, I just want to start with the accounts themselves. Other questions before we move on? Okay, next question. If we are talking about an experience that many people have, what is the nature of that experience? Is it possible to say anything about it? I think it is. And that is because of the oldest account of the resurrection appearances, which it turns out is not in the Gospels. The oldest account is where? In 1 Corinthians, chapter 15, at the beginning of the chapter. Paul says, he reminds the Corinthians, I handed over to you at the beginning what I received. How that Jesus died and he was buried. Paul emphasizes that. He didn't just appear to die. He was really dead. He was so dead that he was buried. And then he was raised on the third day. And Paul says all of this was in accordance with the scriptures. And then he gives the earliest account of the resurrection appearances. It is 20 years older than the earliest gospel, Mark. And listen to what he says. He says, Kai ophe keva, eta tois dodeca. Now that's usually translated, he appeared to Cephas and to the 12. Who is Cephas? Peter. That's the Aramaic version of Peter's name. And then Paul says, Epeta ophe, epino pentecostios adelphois papax. He appeared to 500 brothers and sisters at once. And Paul adds, of whom the majority are still alive. Mark. And then he says, epeta ophe Jacobu, eta tois apostolos pasim. It's usually translated, he appeared to James and all the apostles. And then Paul concludes the list. Last of all, as if to someone born in an untimely way, he appeared even to me. Now, again, wild diversity. No mention of whom? Mary Magdalene or the other Marys. The first one is Cephas and the 12. And then 500 brothers and sisters at once. And then James. That James is not the brother of John, it's the brother of Jesus. James and all the apostles. And finally,
You bring that up. There's a apocryphal reading I told you. Apocryphal of James.
yes,
And he mentioned James says he was talked to by Jesus 500 and some days after his death. Is that the same James?
Yes, it
It says
is.
brother of James.
It's the brother of Jesus. Eventually, he becomes the leader of the Christ followers in Jerusalem. And Paul talks about him in Galatians. Now, in every one of these accounts that Paul gives, he uses the same Greek verb to describe the experience. It is in Greek the verb ophe. Ophe. Can you say that with me? Transcribe it. Ophe. Here's your Greek grammar lesson. You knew you wouldn't get away without it. It is an aorist past tense. Passive, an aorist passive. Third person singular. Larry, if we translate it literally, in most English versions, it's translated, he appeared. This is a passive. Past passive, third singular. A literal translation would be what? He was seen. That's right. He was seen. It's very interesting. Paul uses no other verb to describe it. What does that suggest about the nature of the experience that people have? When we use the English verb appeared, it makes it sound like that there was an apparition out there in space somewhere, right? But the verb that Paul uses suggests that the experience was more what? Subjective, internal. It was a matter of something seen. Clearly, we're beginning, I think, to get the idea that this experience falls into a category which the first authors could not name. They didn't have a vocabulary to name to describe the nature of the experience. Can we say anything more than that? I think we can. You may have noticed when we spent some time going through the stories that in some cases, Jesus was at first unrecognizable. Did you notice that? The two disciples on the road to Emmaus, they walk and talk with him for how long? 7 miles. It takes a while. I have one of these telephones that records how many steps I take a day, right? Going back and forth to Fordham, I walk 2 miles a day. But I would have to triple that, right? They walk and talk with him for 7 miles, and they only recognize him when he sits at the table, and they recognize that gesture that they had seen so many times before at the feeding of the 5,000, in the table fellowship that they had with him. Took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and their eyes were open. And then, what about Mary Magdalene? One of his dearest, most beloved disciples. In the garden, she is approached by one whom she mistakes for the gardener. She doesn't recognize him at first. She comes to recognize him only when what? He says her name. So we can conclude, I think, that he was at first unrecognizable. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul insists twice in his argument that in the resurrection, there will be what? Change. We talked about it last week. Paul says, don't be foolish. The resurrection body, the pneumatikon soma, the spiritual body, will not be exactly the same as the gross material body. Paul says we may not all die, we may not all sleep, but we will all be what? Changed. So Paul acknowledges that the resurrection involved change of some sort. Jesus was not immediately recognizable. Yes.
Well, it's like today, see what you expect. Like if someone is working on a uniform or whatever, and you see them outside of that, you don't recognize them at first.
Right.
And I'm thinking, is that expectation that they're not expecting to see him?
I think you are thinking you are doing a good job of breaking your way into these reports, right? And trying to make sense of it. The resurrection falls into a category that is not easily defined. And the people who give us the first reports about it are doing the best that they can to communicate it. The third thing that we can say about the nature of the resurrection, and this is a point that both Luke and John insist upon. The one who was seen was not what? A ghost. In Luke's gospel, Luke makes the point explicit. The disciples are startled. Jesus says to them, I am not a ghost. Come touch me and see that it is me. In the Gospel of John, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus then, after he denies that he is a ghost, he sits down at the table and eats what? A piece of broiled fish. In the Gospel of John, Jesus cooks a meal for the disciples and eats it with them. So these authors are trying to say something about the nature of the resurrection experience. What they experienced was not a ghost. Now, why is that important? It's because ghost stories abounded in the first century. The Greek novels, of which we have dozens, are full of ghost stories. Ancient people loved them. And they believed in ghosts. That the ghost, the disembodied ghost of a person, remained around the tomb, that it often came and visited the homes of loved ones. And the gospel writers are trying to tell us he was not a ghost. Just as Paul, we discovered last week, insists that the risen Jesus was a soma of body. Not a gross material body, but a body nevertheless. A pneumatikon soma. What does that mean? No one knows. Okay. I believe that is what we are able to say about the nature of the experience. And as a historian and an interpreter, I can't go further. But it is easier to say what the resurrection meant to the first followers of Jesus. That we can say. And I think it meant four things. Number one, it meant vindication. In the book of Acts, on the day of Pentecost, Peter and the other apostles experience being filled with the Holy Spirit. A rushing mighty wind, tongues of fire appear over their head. And Peter stands up and says to the crowd, this Jesus whom you crucified has now been made what? Lord and Christ. And Peter goes on to explain that God in the resurrection God vindicated his life. That's a point that the author of the Gospel of Luke, the first volume of the two-volume masterpiece, Luke repeatedly structures his work so that the reader comes away with the understanding that at the center of human history, there was a model life. There was a paradigm of the way a person ought to live. Luke's Jesus goes about doing good, healing the sick, proclaiming good news. Luke evidently believed that at the center of time, there was a model life. And in the book of Acts, Luke makes explicit that the resurrection meant that God declared this life to be the right one. He was condemned and crucified, condemned under Roman law, but God, by means of the resurrection, made it right. His life is the right one. The second thing that the resurrection meant very clearly was exaltation. At the beginning of Acts chapter 1, Luke describes the ascension of Jesus. By the way, Luke says that prior to the ascension, Jesus had appeared to his disciples and had been teaching them for how long? 40 days. 40 days. Next week, we will look at an early Christian treatise on the resurrection that expands that 40 days into 500. So there's an interesting diversity there too. But eventually, after 40 days, Jesus takes the disciples to a mountain and a cloud appears and he is withdrawn from their sight. Luke says, Acts chapter 1, that while the disciples were looking up into heaven, marveling, an angel said to them, "He will return to you, just as you have seen him go." In 1 Thessalonians 4, the text that we started with 2 weeks ago, Paul tells the grieving Thessalonians what? Jesus will return with the voice of an archangel and the trumpet of God. He will return, and the dead in Christ will be raised, first of all. And then all of us who are left hanging around will be snatched up to a meeting with the Lord and our loved ones. So finally, in the book of Acts, there is an account of the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Stephen, one of the first evangelists, is stoned to death outside the temple. And just before he dies, he looks up into heaven and sees what? Jesus seated at the right hand of God. So for the first Christians, the resurrection meant the exaltation of Jesus to be with God. He was at God's right hand. The third thing that the resurrection meant, evidently judging from the sources, is that in his resurrection, Jesus is the first fruit of a general resurrection that is coming to those who follow him. That's what Paul says. He is the first fruit. In the fall, a tree often puts forth what? Early fruit. And that is a promise that what? A big harvest will eventually come. That's the language that is used to describe the meaning of Jesus' resurrection. Because God raised Jesus, Paul says, God will raise us. And finally, and this one is not a meaning of the resurrection that is stated anywhere in the text, but I think it is clearly justified by the consequences. And to me, it is the most important and moving. The resurrection meant that the followers of Jesus did not give up on his message and his mission. Yes, according to Luke, they hid in an upper room for a number of days, frightened that the same fate that befell Jesus would come upon them. But eventually they what? They came back out onto the streets and they took up his message about God's kingdom. They took up his work of healing. They did not give up. And from a historical point of view, of course, that is the most important meaning, consequence of the resurrection. Those who follow Jesus to this day, who want to follow him, have not given up on what he began. When the COVID pandemic overwhelmed us a couple of years ago, the president of the university where I teach in New York, Joseph McShane, he is a Jesuit. And when so many people in New York were dying, the ambulances, the sirens were wailing night and day. The COVID hit New York City very hard in the beginning. And so every Sunday morning, for a year, in the first year of the pandemic, into the email box of every faculty, staff member, student, there came a pastoral message from our president telling us not to give up. Because of the resurrection of Jesus, don't give up. Continue the work of Jesus. Keep it going. All right. I know there's always the danger that I will talk you to death, and I almost have. I'm sorry. We've said so much today. I don't know if you've heard the resurrection presented exactly like this before, and there is still material that we have to look at. Next week, we have not yet talked about the Gospel of Peter, a manuscript that was discovered buried in the grave of a Coptic monk in 1886. And guess what it has? None of our Gospels attempt to describe the moment of the resurrection. That moment is described in the Gospel of Peter when Jesus comes forth into the early morning on Sunday. Next week, we will look at it. And we will look at a treatise on the resurrection, an early Christian treatise. And the heads up, Joan, I will be sending an extensive handout for next week. It is a collection of the earliest Christian sarcophagi, most of which are found at the Vatican, but there is a couple up here at Oberlin College here in Ohio. Early sarcophagi that picture the resurrection. Not the resurrection of Jesus, but the resurrection of the dead believer. And there are lessons to be learned from looking at those early Christian sarcophagi about what they were hoping for and what they believed. Questions about what you've heard today, Larry?
What was the name of the professor who was the rise of Christianity?
Oh, so he does have a connection to Yale. His name is Rodney Stark, and he was actually a professor in California a lot. He took a sabbatical, and he went to Yale in order to converse with the great Wayne Meeks. And at the end of that year, he produced this book.
And did not cite the various pandemics that came across. And
that all of the people who were so scared, they abandoned their family members, and Galen went to Turkey, and
Yes.
and the Christians paid because of their belief in the resurrection.
Exactly.
And therefore, Christianity fought evil.
Oh, exactly. And therefore, at the end of the pandemic, the Christian population had grown because ordinary nursing, even without vaccines, right? The provision of water, food, clean clothing, sanitary conditions results in a higher survival rate. And one of those authors, Christian authors, that reports the difference between the way that Christians responded to the pandemic and the way that their pagan neighbors responded. One of those authors, Dionysius of Alexandria, puzzles. He doesn't know the explanation. He puzzles over the fact that although the best of our brothers and sisters died caring for the sick, some did not die.
Immunity.
They had acquired immunity. They didn't have a word for it yet. But he puzzles over the fact that some did not die. He said they took the disease on themselves, but they didn't perish. Really interesting. And both Cyprian of Carthage and Dionysius of Alexandria, who lived through the plague, they both said the difference in the way Christians responded was because of their belief in the resurrection. It makes a difference what you believe, it turns out. Other questions, comments? Yes.
There's a time when a Christian questioned the question about how do I get into heaven?
Yes.
And he told you that's only
Right.
And I suggest, and I'm asking that question, does that suggest that they were talking about resurrection then, and nobody wanted to report it because it was super possible?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Very good insight. Yes, I think there was actually talk about it. Even the earliest gospel, Mark, reports that Jesus on 3 occasions tried to explain to his disciples that he was going to suffer, he was going to die, but he would rise again. And Mark says that the disciples did not comprehend. They didn't understand. It's the same in the Gospel of John. John says that it was only afterwards, as they remembered, as they called back to memory what he had told them, that they began to understand.
And I believe in parable.
Right. Now, we have to realize that among the texts that were produced by Jews in the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the period of the Second Temple, there are no texts in that period that speak of the Messiah dying. Isn't that interesting? So if most people did not think that the Messiah was going to die, if they thought he would be a conquering liberator, if they didn't expect the Messiah to die, therefore what? They weren't expecting him to rise. And the efforts of Jesus to foretell his resurrection apparently were not comprehended. Right? They were comprehended only in memory, but that people began to talk about it at an early period, that they asked themselves, what was that happened to us? That they compared stories of what they had seen. The sources suggest that all of that was happening. Well, John, I know I've gone longer than I should have. People are leaving to go to the choir. Please come back next week. If God permits, I will be here in person. Diane with me, perhaps even my son with me. I'm surprised that Locke didn't ask a question today. Years ago, I was teaching at a big church downtown, and I was explaining a saying of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus says, don't stop seeking until you find. And the hand of that young man went up at the back of the room and asked, Professor Welborn, can you tell me you are still seeking? Okay, thank you all so much for today, and I hope to see you next week. So,